haven't filmed a video in a very long time and this feels really weird. Anyway, hello my dears, glad to have you here. Also welcome to all the new friends who subscribed in the last couple weeks that I took off for my life to momentarily fall apart, but we're putting it back together. Today we're going to talk about disability in Pompeii and in ancient Rome because I'm doing that thing where I turn my finals into videos so that I have actual motivation to do them. And once this video comes out, I will officially be complete with my entire undergraduate degree and I will never have to do school again, which is wonderful. But I feel like I should introduce myself because it has been a minute. So hi, my name is Sydney, my pronouns are they, them. I am an openly queer, disabled, autistic, trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, and disability advocate. I make a lot of videos about minority media representation and accessible education, literally anything else vaguely disability related that I find particularly interesting. You're welcome to like, comment, subscribe, whatever brings you joy. Glad to have you here. Also, image description, I am a white, or video description, not image. Video description, I am a white person in my early 20s with light brown shoulder, a little longer than shoulder length, like chest length, it's grown, light brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a caramel colored dress with a collar and a tan vest over it, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. You know, I thought about wearing a toga for this video, but then I realized that that would take effort. So I am instead wearing the exact same outfit that I wore the day that we went to Pompeii when I studied abroad because it felt like a fun little thing to do. I'm gonna try to intersperse some of my old footage in this video as much as I can where applicable because I think that's fun. If you want to see my truly terribly edited vlog thing from a year and a half ago, I have linked it to the card above and also in the description. Also, as always, all of my sources are in the description, formatted as like brief titles and links rather than fancy traditional format because I find that clunky and inaccessible. And also, interestingly enough, nearly half of the things I read were from Bryn Mawr College, so clearly I went to the wrong historically women's college for this topic. Also, I found a database that's of a bunch of scholars who studied disability in antiquity that I included as well if you wanted to learn more about this topic on your own time if you find it interesting. And also if I run out of room for them in the description, I will instead make a Google Doc with all my sources and link that for you instead. Anyway, I'm gonna stop stalling. Let's get into the video. Now, the first thing to do before we talk about ancient disability is to remind ourselves about the history of modern disability because much like race or gender, these concepts that we think of as given categories since they've been around a while and are so ingrained in all of our systems and institutions today completely change based on culture and time period. When we talk about sociological categories in history, we need to be deliberate as to what lens we are looking at them through, whether we're trying to figure out how they categorize these concepts back then and looking at those categories or applying our own modern categorizations onto an ancient culture. It's really easy to get those things mixed up, so we're going to try not to do that. As a very brief overview of the history of our modern categorization of disability, if you want to learn more, head to my disability and capitalism video. But the idea of disability was created during the Industrial Revolution and rise of capitalism. People had historically been tied to land to work that land, so there wasn't really competition for getting jobs. And creating your own accommodations in that setting was fairly simple because nothing was very standardized, more people could work, and generally communities were smaller, so everybody would help care for the handful of housebound people in the community who were unable to work. Not that serfdom or slavery was in any way a good idea or like a dream or ideal or anything like that, but just that they didn't need to categorize things as much. When capitalism showed up, an economic system that's based on profit, serfdoms disappeared and all of a sudden people were competing for work and there became a population of workers who were seen as less efficient because they couldn't work fast enough or well enough or follow orders or fit the norms and were easily replaceable with other people. That class of workers became known as the disabled and categorized as a social problem who should be segregated from the rest of society. But even that isn't super solid. The definition of disability and what classifies as disabled changes based on what can be capitalized upon. For example, recently we're seeing a lot of the why you should hire autistic people in the workplace articles, which are trying to remove autistic people from the disabled category into the mainstream to exploit us for labor. We also know that in time periods where governments have less money and resources to provide to their disabled populations, suddenly the list of what counts as disability gets smaller and social services also get smaller. We typically see an expansion of the disability category and of social services after wars end because it looks really bad if you had people die for your country and then your country immediately abandons them, which to be fair is exactly what we're doing right now. But historically it's been a little better. Sort of. Anyway, there's also the fact that mental disorders are majorly categorized as anything that is different from a cishet white man and have only really been directly classified since the Second World War. And also most disabilities are only disabling in that their environment is disabling, so culturally what counts as disability is wholly different depending on where and when a society exists. So anyway, all of this is to say that disability as we know it today has only been around for a couple hundred years, and we need to keep that in mind when we look at what we categorize as disability in ancient Roman life. One way to more easily analyze disability in history is by looking at the difference between impairment and disability, focusing more on physical impairments that can be separated from the societal construct of disability, which rather than redefine that whole thing, we're going to take a gander over to my disability and DEI video. Now, the first thing to note is that disability and impairment are two different things definitionally. Obviously, they can overlap, but the distinction is very important. Impairment is defined as any loss or abnormality of psychological, physiological, or anatomical structure or function, while disability means any restriction or lack, often resulting from an impairment, not always, of ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. So for example, my chronic migraines are both a disability and an impairment. They're an impairment because when I have one, I can't drive and I often can't walk. Regardless of social norms and accessibility, they do get in the way of me being able to live the life how I want to live my life. They become a disability when they are triggered or made worse by lighting or inaccessibility or discrimination. Now, I count my happiness and other emotional things in a situation specifically on my average number of migraine days, and I found that the more discriminated against and miserable I am in a situation, the more sick I get. So if I'm pretty content and I feel safe, I'll have maybe 1 or 2 migraine days a month, usually caused by the occasional rainstorm or bad night's sleep. And if I don't feel safe or have my needs met, if I ask for accommodations and they're denied, etc., I can have up to 30 migraine days a month. So that's a thing. That is very rare for me at this point because I can now verbalize what my needs are, and also I have the Americans with Disabilities Act memorized and I'm not afraid to use it. I also know the Italian one, if you ever need it. I translated that for reasons. But anyway, issues are usually fixed pretty quickly for me at this point, and then it's mostly impairment only. But the other important thing to know is that you can be disabled without having any impairment, and that's kind of where this whole video comes in. The social model of disability basically says that the disabled people are only disabled because the world is inaccessible to us, otherwise we're just different. And that often expands to other minorities as well. For example, if a wheelchair user went into a building where the women's and men's restrooms were down or up a flight of stairs, they're disabled because they cannot do the stairs in order to pee. If a non-binary person went into the same building and also needed to pee, that is equally as inaccessible to them because they do not have a restroom that is inclusive to their gender. And if for some horrible reason there is a whites only sign outside of that theater, people of color are also equally disabled in this situation because they cannot enter the establishment altogether. Now, these minority people are discriminated against in a way that makes them disabled because they are restricted from being able to do something in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. Also, it should be noted that most of the time when somebody discriminates or is prejudiced against a disabled person, it's usually based on the belief, whether they're aware of that or not, that typical abilities are superior, because that's the definition of ableism. So today we're going to look a little bit more at impairments and how those were socialized as disabilities in ancient Roman culture and also ancient Greek culture, because pretty much every source covers both of them and there was massive overlap. And I know that like ancient Greece and classical Greece are different things technically, and then there's like other ones, and the terminology. My terminology is not going to be perfect. We're not going to get super technical with it. Ancient Greece. We're just using that because I know that that's what people picture. The specific thing, yeah. Anyway, I'm also going to use the word disability here more than impairment here, but I just want to be super clear about these distinctions before we begin. So, with that, how did Romans categorize disability? They kind of didn't. Ancient Greeks and Romans didn't really have an overarching umbrella term for disability like we do. They categorized and conceptualized and treated differences in their own ways as different categories. Now, I will say that this idea that everything was completely separated, as it is written in most of the sources I read, does not feel entirely plausible or likely to me, because yes, there may not have been a social category of the disabled. Frankly, many disabled people today don't even realize that that's a social category and identify solely with their disability. But since those things were medicalized and categorized on some level in ancient culture separately, there had to be some level of lumping people together, such as seeing deaf and blind people to be somewhat similar. And one of the reasons I say this is because We can see that happening with any differences that could be viewed as deformities in many writings of the time. Those deformities were rarely specified, and we will get into that situation shortly, but that word could categorize a bunch of disparate impairments, which therefore creates some sort of umbrella term for some disabilities. Just one that's different from how we view disability today. There are also cases of people with disabilities living together, particularly groups of military veterans who didn't want to return home, and leper colonies, which I hate calling them that because I know that there's many nicer ways to say it. That's the only way people will know what I mean. I apologize. There's also the story of, I love this story so much. There's a story of two people, one who had a mobility impairment and another guy who was blind, and they became friends and they would travel together. And the blind guy would give the guy with the mobility issues a piggyback while the guy with mobility issues would yell directions so the blind person knew where to go. It just brings me a lot of joy. Ancient Greco-Romans also saw things as disability that we don't really see as disability today, such as infertility or being intersex. Though again, I feel like those two things are still super medicalized, so I don't fully agree with that scholarly sentiment. Now, I came upon a whole lot of things in a general tone of, we are so much more advanced in how we handle disability now than they were back then, and look how far we've come as a society since ancient Rome, which always annoys me, because that is an inherently self-serving view of history. It ignores how much of what we do today will be seen as barbaric and obscene in another 1,000 years. Think about plastic surgery, for example. And also, humans are always just going to human. And I feel like in a lot of my deep dive history videos, we always come to the conclusion that effectively nothing has changed. We've just changed the names of stuff and how we present it to the public, like freak shows evolving into reality TV and mental institutions evolving into nursing homes and eugenics becoming genetics. Another one of the things that I saw written about somewhere was how intellectual impairment back then was a larger category than it is today because they saw poor decision making as intellectual impairment. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around why that's different, because we still call people crazy and insane and mentally defective as insults regularly. That is not any different. So again, humans are going to human. Ancient Greco-Roman culture also cared a lot about speech and the ability to orate, assuming that if you can't speak fluently, you can't think fluently, and therefore you're defective, making, according to scholars, speech impediments more often an issue than we see them as today. But again, how do we treat non-speaking people in today's society, or say someone with a stutter? Oh, we immediately put them into hours and hours of speech therapy because we think that if they cannot communicate in a very specific manner, nobody's going to take them seriously. Weirdly similar. Another thing that I found very interesting was the fact that ancient doctors would pick and choose what to treat, avoiding incurable or chronic health problems as much as possible because it was bad for their reputations if they couldn't fix people, so disabled people were often on their own in managing care, which is one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of written evidence of various disabilities that definitely existed fairly prominently at the time. Which, first of all, says a lot about the effectiveness of ancient doctors, but also, arguably, this hasn't really changed either. Doctors regularly get frustrated with chronically ill people because they can't fix us, often refusing to listen to us, believe us, or take on complicated cases. Again, thinking like an analyst of modern day records 1,000 years in the future, I feel like they might come to the same conclusion about how we handle disability as we are about the ancient Greco-Romans. But one really important thing about classification of disability in ancient Greek and Rome is that disability was most likely way more common than it is now, simply due to the conditions and the ways of life. Like in Pompeii, wastewater was regularly just running through the streets. There were donkeys working at bakeries. The baths were rife with bacteria because there wasn't really a way to wash them. People cleansed themselves with oil. They all shared a collective sponge on a stick as toilet paper. And a lot of other unsanitary conditions. And that would definitely cause impairment in a solid portion of people living then, as well as causing congenital issues in babies. Then there's also like disease, illness, aging, malnutrition, inbreeding, hazardous working conditions, heavy labor. Like, even think of the things that from the 1800s that we look back on now and go, wow, maybe putting lead in your mouth was a bad idea. The Roman Empire fell over 1,300 years before that, so I'm fairly sure they had some sketchy working practices. So because of that, scholars conclude that impairment and disability was, on some level, the norm, which meant that the kinds of bodies considered normate, which is the disability studies word for normal or typical without those connotations, were a much larger swath of bodies than what we consider to be normate today. But that being said, there was also a really large cultural emphasis on the ideal body or the ideal human type, and therefore any physical difference was a mark of inferiority. And given that, I expected to be able to say something here about like racial markers being a part of this and how all discrimination based itself in ableism because they cared so much about the body and differing bodies back then as well. But turns out that actually was not the case here. Rather than judge people on skin color and categorize them that way, judgment was more on things like specific accents or body language or what people wore or where they ate instead of direct physical appearance. That being said, society was very much split into class categories that were often marked by clothing. So there was that element of physical appearance being involved. And also, like, on some level, if somebody is a slave or otherwise a hard laborer, you can tell class by physicality as well. Also, there's records of some slaves having, like, chain belts and, like, other garments that they wore that documented that they were slaves. And while they didn't use specific marks of physical appearance, such as skin color, to categorize and degrade people, they did still seem to have based all of their discrimination in ableism on some level. A lot of their social currency was on specific markers of what they considered to be intelligence as well as physical ability to do things, which is the same today, frankly. But back to class for a second. Just like in modern day, your class status had a lot to do with how your disability was handled. For example, really rich people, regardless of ability, had servants and enslaved people who would help them to bathe and dress and read and write and eat, and would carry them around on litters or cots. So if somebody was really, really rich and had a mobility issue and needed to be carried everywhere, would have absolutely no problem doing that, and people might not even know. And there are also a ton of examples of this that came up in my research. And also you could afford fancier medical care and prostheses as well. There's also the element of like, oh, the emperor's just a little mentally different, but like, he's the emperor, so it's all good and everything's fine. Meanwhile, a poorer person acting the exact same way might be abandoned by their family or socially ridiculed, in the same way that we reward certain traits in a quirky, absent-minded professor, but punish those same traits in somebody who works any other non-academic job. Pliny the Elder, who died in the Pompeii eruption and had asthma, and that's part of why he died in the Pompeii eruption. Disability history, yay. He wrote in Natural History about the son of a senatorial family that was close to the imperial family who was born without speech and was most likely to have been deaf, and his name was Quintus Pedius. I'm about to say a lot of Roman things and none of it's going to come out right. Emperor Augustus gave him special permission to be taught to paint rather than become a senator. Apparently he was actually a really good painter, but unfortunately he died pretty young. So he was able to get a different job that was seen for lower classes because he needed to be doing something. But in his privileged position, it would have been a lot easier had he been born unable to walk than born deaf because of the line of work he was expected to go into. Meanwhile, a peasant child in the same situation would be able to work without any issue and may have in fact been an asset because of that disability, but had that peasant child been born unable to walk, they would have much more serious problems for their ability to work, which again, disability is a social construct and heavily reliant on environment. Disability was also everywhere in their myths and other media of the time. For example, the Greek god Hephaestus had some sort of limb difference that caused him to hobble and limp, and he was the only god with an impairment, mythologically because his mom was so disgusted by his ugly face when he was born that she chucked him off Mount Olympus, and he was raised by water nymphs and they taught him how to forge and craft. It was believed that trades such as smithing, carpentry, pottery making, painting, etc. would become disabling over time as they were generally somewhat sedentary, so people would develop disproportionate muscles of the various muscle groups they needed to use for certain skills. And these fields also came with a lot of work injuries, including scarring and poisoning and amputation by accident and other things like that. And also on the flip side, it seems like disabled people were drawn to these trades as they were more easily adaptable. But anyway, one of their gods was disabled, which I think is really cool. Speaking of the arts, it was also very common for figurines and other art pieces to have physical disabilities, many of which are completely accurate portrayals of real diseases and disabilities. Scholars are not quite sure if these figurines were meant to teach medical things or for entertainment or for being grotesque and entertaining, because like in ancient Roman culture, laughter and silly things ward off evil. One of the reasons you can find some really phallic designs of things. I would also argue that on some level, if disabled people were drawn to artistic trades, it feels logical that they would create some artistic renditions of themselves. Disabled people were also well known to work in other arts as poets, bards, musicians, dancers, and acrobats. There's also a pretty large market for visibly disabled enslaved people because people wanted to keep them to show off to guests or to live as pets or be fools or court jesters. Ugh, gross, but history. There were also many opportunities for disabled people in the sex work industry, which is not what it was called back then, but you know what I mean. That was a whole business as well. But let's talk about disabled children and what happened to them before they got to the work bit of life, which is the first major scholarly debate that we get to talk about today. I truly thought this video was going to be way more straightforward to read 3 papers, research, write it, and then ended up being the sheer amount of triple fact checking that I had to do and then falling into scholarly rabbit holes was wholly uncalled for the amount of work that it took for my first video back. Anyway, content warning for infanticide. If you want to skip this bit, you can head on over to the timecode that's on the screen right now. I'll also say it out loud because I realized that for blind and low vision people, that's not helpful. So go to this timecode.
It's 28 minutes.
Now, one of the first things that came up when researching this was the discussion of infanticide, saying that most disabled people were killed by their parents when they were born, and then kind of using that as like a, well, disabled adults didn't exist because all the kids died, so there's the end of this whole discussion about disabled Romans, which automatically felt very false to me because, first of all, the majority of disabilities you cannot see or figure out at birth. Second of all, a solid chunk of disabilities are not congenital, aka they happen later in life, so we can't be like, oh, disabled people didn't exist because they got rid of all the disabled babies, because, like, people went to war, people got in work accidents, people had chronic illnesses that didn't appear until puberty, because that's how most of them work. And also, I do not believe that ancient Greco-Romans were so heartless as to be like, oh yes, this child I carried in me for 9 months looks wrong, let me leave it in the woods to die without second thought. Like, no matter what, there would have been some babies who slipped through the cracks, and thus began a giant rabbit hole trying to figure out the truth, or at least a more nuanced take. The truth probably does not exist at this point, but let's call this a skeptic's field trip. Now, first thing to know is that many scholars use the word infanticide when they mean exposure, which is a very, very different thing with very, very different connotations, both then and now. Also, there's expiation, which we'll talk about that too, but yeah. So infanticide is the killing of an infant. That's pretty self-explanatory. Expiation is a lot of things, but in this context, it is a ritual killing of an infant to appease the gods. We're gonna get there later. And then exposure was rejecting an infant in the first week of life before they went through all the religious rites that made it a part of the family and community by leaving it somewhere, usually swaddled up in the woods, but could also be in various other places. Sometimes they would leave them like at the market, stuff like that. And that was seen as way more humane than infanticide because there was always the possibility that somebody else could pick up the child and raise it as their own. As I said earlier, there was also market for visibly disabled slaves to be used as entertainment or as pets. And there's also apparently record of people maiming infants before leaving them so they would have better luck as beggars, which is awful. But yeah, a lot of articles on the topic write about how like barbaric the Greco-Romans were for having these laws about killing babies. Technically, those laws did not exist. Any laws that did exist involved exposure, and direct infanticide was legally never encouraged. So let's see what evidence we have for widespread exposure and infanticide that scholars have been directly referencing. First, we have Plato and Aristotle, generally from like 428 to 322 BC, if you smush their lifespans together. They both wrote a lot about how there should be laws preventing people from having deformed children and lots of other really eugenics-y gross stuff. Some have used this as a definitive way to say that ancient Greece and Roman had widespread ideas of infanticide and therefore that it was a common occurrence, but it's generally agreed upon at this point that they were just writing about their own utopias. In general, nobody's quite sure how much exposure or infanticide were actually practiced, but like no matter how much you write about things you want to happen, that does not mean it's actually going to happen, so we can't totally trust them being like, this is what should happen as what actually happened. Then we have the historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who lived from about 60 BC to 7 BC, wrote about a legal responsibility from Romulus, who was the founder of Rome, to dispose of maimed or monstrous infants via exposure, and not infanticide. Scholars think that this might be pointing to the 12 Tables, which were an early Roman constitution of sorts that states a notably deformed child shall be killed immediately, but there's also a lot of speculation as to that particular law and its translation. On some level, Dionysius' writings do show concerns about child rearing and social practices during the Augustan time period that are important to note, more on the side of like keeping the city safe from the god's wrath than like, disabled kids are ugly, let's get rid of them. But we're gonna get to the religious situation shortly. I also read something somewhere about disabled infants in Rome being thrown into the Tiber River, but then I found absolutely nothing else to back that up, so that seems completely mythological. And lastly, we have Plutarch, who lived from about 46 to 120 AD. He wrote in Lives about lives? Who knows? About widespread infanticide of deformed babies, particularly about how, like, in Sparta, they would throw the ill-born into a chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus. I may speak Italian, but this video is a disaster. Anyway, archaeological evidence says that, oh man, that absolutely did not happen. One thing that we do know is that exposure was generally frowned upon starting in the 2nd and 3rd century, likely due to the rise of Christianity, which became the official religion of the empire in 313. Jesus died in 30 AD for timeline perspective, where it became a social thing to show kindness to disabled people. Though that on some level did lead to more mercy killings, it also led to more people believing that all children are made in the image of God and should therefore be preserved and protected, and it is believed that this mindset is partially the reason that exposure became illegal in 374 AD. Another thing often used as evidence of widespread infanticide in ancient Rome is the archaeological finding of large numbers of infant graves at a site in Hambledon, Buckinghamshire, which frankly, both of those words sound like they came out of a British word generator. Anyway, it was discovered in 1921 and everybody was like, the Romans were baby murderers. But if we look at the context clues, These infants were buried long after exposure was made illegal. Infanticide had always been illegal. Exposure objectively would not look like this in any way at all whatsoever. And also, if you're going to illegally murder someone, actually all murder's illegal, so that was redundant. If you're going to murder someone, you are not going to bury them in a marked grave in your backyard. That seems objectively like an unwise choice. So it is way more likely that, much like how 1 in 5 babies would not survive infancy in the 1700s, babies just died a lot, which is sad, but that is how things were, and this was not like a mass murder situation. Generally, whether exposure was super common or not, from an archaeological perspective, there is virtually no chance that we would find any evidence of it because bones would be weirdly scattered, they'd be hard to find, and also smaller bones degrade more quickly, so they may not have survived anyway. What we do know from an archaeological perspective is that there were many people with congenital differences that would have been visible from birth who lived to adulthood and were buried normally alongside other Romans. Also, the Sparta thing about throwing babies into a chasm definitely wasn't true, if only because King Agesilaus was, I don't know if I pronounced that right, I'm so sorry guys. He was a Spartan king born with a leg difference. There's also records of disability in many other Roman and Greek emperors and kings as well, so like it wouldn't make sense for them to be like, oh yes, every disformed baby was killed except all of the royals that were disabled. Like, what? This also makes sense when you look back at the context clues as well. One of the most common discussions to come up is that all these things about monsters and deformities are super ambiguous and vague, so how could they actually be enforced? That does make me think about how like vague the categorization of feeble-mindedness was in the mid-1900s that got hundreds of thousands of people sterilized, so I don't think it's impossible for ambiguous laws to be enforced, but that aside, the Romans kind of really like to write out everything hyper-specifically, so the fact that this was never written hyper-specifically is notably weird. Also, the fact that there were laws trying to regulate the rearing of disabled infants means that people did regularly have disabled children and wanted to keep them. Because if everybody was like, oh, my baby is wrong, time to get rid of it, and that was universally accepted, there wouldn't be this much writing about it and this many legal discussions about it. And again, we know that this is the case because many of them lived to adulthood and were buried normally, so they were a regular part of society. Which, to pull us out of this for a second, as we always do when we find a major scholarly debate or myth, let's ask ourselves, who does this narrative of ancient Romans killed all their disabled babies actually benefit? Like, why is this a myth that continues to be perpetuated? Because sometimes that gives us the answer as to why something might be super skewed or objectively wrong. Were you thinking, wow, I bet eugenicists use this as a way to defend eugenic practices and mercy killings because it's historical? Congratulations, you have the right answer. Obviously, there's the general, like, society self-serving aspect of, wow, we're so much more advanced than those barbaric ancient Romans that makes this narrative really popular. But also, eugenicists regularly use this today to go, well, the Romans did it, so why can't we? It's the only humane thing to do. Ew. As someone who has spent way too long in the realm of disability history, particularly of disabled children, while we don't know the specific prevalence of exposure and infanticide in ancient Rome, I have a feeling it is probably on some level somewhat similar to today, which sounds shocking if you're not familiar with all these things, but as of right now, according to the Ruderman Family Foundation, one disabled person is murdered by a family member or caregiver approximately once a week in the US. And that is only the reported cases, so it's estimated to likely be higher. In ancient Rome, it may have been a bit more than that, and then there's also the added aspect of like how many children didn't make it on their own because there was no medical care for them, but that would be my general prevalence guess. The one thing that we do know more certainly about infanticide is the history of intersex people. Their births were recorded alongside unusual animal births, so they were clearly seen as subhuman, and they were usually murdered shortly after birth. There are records of some parents hiding these children from the state and then them growing up, only to be found and killed later in life. Intersex people and other physical monstrosities were seen as divine punishment and warnings of impending doom, and they were therefore murdered or expiated as a ritual offering to the gods. And that, friends, finally transitions us out of talking about murder. Literally half the research I did for this video was about murder, and I really just wanted to learn about the lives of disabled people, but I guess I should not have been surprised because modern disability history isn't pretty either. Now, while it is believed that some disabled people were signs of wrath from the gods and therefore getting rid of them would keep the city safe, it is also believed that some differences were gifts from the gods. The most notable example, which is not just in ancient Rome, it's in a lot of different cultures, is that people who experience seizures are seen as blessed and touched by the gods. Though Hippocrates did write about how it was just a disease and everybody needed to chill out, but that didn't necessarily work. So yeah. Also, did you know that Julius Caesar had frequent seizures? That was an interesting find. Yeah. Anyway, we are talking about religion is what we're doing. So generally we know that visibly disabled people were excluded from specific religious rites and all religious offices, with the exception of those being sacrifices via expiation, but sad. But that does not mean that they were excluded from religion itself. And that is a very important distinction because we have proof that on some level they were very much involved in it. Ancient Roman religion was an offer things to the gods so they'll look favorably upon you kind of situation, and people typically offered votives that were figurines in the shape of something connected to the request that was being made. And some of the most common votives are body parts and babies. And the most common body parts are feet and legs, some of which can generally be categorized as visually representing certain diseases. And it's generally agreed upon that this means that people were asking the gods for cures to hurt limbs or illnesses or pains that affected various body parts. And it makes sense that legs and feet would be the most requested to fix because the ancient Roman lifestyle was very walking heavy. And the ratios of feet and legs to everything else also stayed consistent between sanctuary sites on the countryside and in the city, meaning that everybody generally relied equally as much on their lower limbs to get around. Somewhat ironically, most of these sanctuary sites were kind of far from city centers and required travel in order to get there, often up really steep hills. Dr. Debbie Sneed has written about an ancient healing sanctuaries, I believe just in Greece, but maybe also in Rome, having ancient ramps on them, such as a specific temple that starts with the letter A that I'm not going to try to pronounce at Epidaurus, showing some level of accessibility. But to be fully honest, that feels like the equivalent of, yeah, we have an elevator, but you have to go up a flight of stairs to get to the elevator. And we're going to talk about prostheses and mobility aids in just a second, but also wheeled mobility aids did not exist for adults in the ancient Greco-Roman world. This does not mean that the ramps were not helpful, because ramps are super helpful for people with any kind of mobility issue, but I do have a lot more questions about the temple ramp situation that I don't think I'm going to get answered. Anyway, before we get into the accommodations and prosthetics, which are super interesting, disabled people also had laws protecting them. Athens was the only state in antiquity known to do this, but they had pensions for disabled people, and there's record of a disabled man arguing as to why he's disabled enough to receive that pension, which is still how things work today. There's also the story of Gaius Gemellus Horigenes in the 2nd century, who was low vision, and his neighbors used that to take advantage of him, as did his tax collector, and he wrote tons of petitions to the government asking for their help in sorting things out and doing what was right, which means that there on some level had to be protections in place, otherwise why would he bother writing to them about this? Now the last thing that came up legally is that, as we know, a significant portion of disabled people are elderly, and many Greek and Roman states had significant amounts of laws that required children to care for their parents into old age to deal with that aspect of disability as well. In the realm of prosthetics, because these are things that we can archaeologically locate, there's a lot of evidence of prostheses existing in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And also, there are a lot of written accounts and also a lot of paintings. We know about crutches, walking sticks and staffs, as well as skeletal remains showing bone wear from crutches and corrective footwear. They've also found prostheses ranging from simple wooden peg legs to a fancy combination of like wood, metal, and leather that are specifically personalized for certain people. There's also evidence for wheeled things that look like modern walkers, but only for children, not adults, which means that if adults with mobility issues needed to get around and they couldn't use a walking stick, staff, or crutches, they would need to be carried around, which for rich people, again, wasn't really a problem. Also, there were hair prostheses, which I think is very interesting. My favorite prosthetic story is of a farmer whose name was Minden, and he cut down a tree, and then a spider crawled out from under that tree, and it bit his leg, and then he got gangrene, so then they had to cut off his leg, and so he used the wood from that tree to make himself a wooden leg, which is delightful. The other thing that I love a lot is that there is a fresco that was found in the house of Julia Felix in Pompeii, and that seems to show a man with his eyes closed walking with a cane and a guide dog. And we know that guide dogs were fairly regular occurrences in ancient Rome and are also written about in ancient Chinese scrolls, so they were around, which is delightful. I want to learn more about ancient dog training. Unfortunately, that's the thing that nobody's researching as far as I can tell. I looked for a while. But speaking of Pompeii, the class that I'm making this video for as my final is called Pompeii and the Archaeology of Daily Life in the Roman World. So let's pivot into a discussion of Pompeii, because that's what I meant to make this video about. Followed by issues with accessibility and archaeology, because that's a conversation that needs to happen, and then accessibility in modern Pompeii, and then we're done, and we did it. I very much meant for this video to be shorter. I just kept getting interested in things and curious, and I wanted to learn more things, and then I found more unrelated things, and none of them were what I said I was going to write about, so I had to keep making it longer. I hope you're having a good time. I am. I'm having a great time. Okay, so little crash course in Pompeii. It's a city. It exists here on a map. Kind of at the top of the southern half of Italy, on the west coast of the country. It's kind of where all the train lines end in modern day. Everything below that is buses, hence why my friends and I got slightly stuck there, but that's not a story for today. If you don't know anything about Italy, it's fairly close to the Amalfi Coast. It sits next to a volcano called Mount Vesuvius that's very pretty and also very tall, and I'm very good at describing things. Anyway, it was on a trade route, so there were a lot of different kinds of people there, but it became a Roman colony in AD BC. It was kind of used as a vacation spot for the elite of Rome because it was easily accessible via the main road from Rome. Wasn't super important to Roman politics or anything, but it definitely existed, much in the way that like Italians feel about Sorrento or New Englanders feel about Cape Cod. if you have other examples for where you live, you can put those in the comments. Pompeii is obviously really well known for the whole volcano thing. Vesuvius has erupted a couple times. The famous one that we're all thinking about took place in 79 AD. There's a whole scholarly debate as to whether it was in August of 79 or November of 79, mostly because the literature of like contemporary literature has like 13 different dates recorded for the eruption. And then also some crops were found in excavation that would have been harvested at a different time, but then the kinds of clothing people were wearing was different. But I feel like we can't judge a season based on what people were wearing when they were trying to run away from a natural disaster. Either way, doesn't really matter for today's purposes. This video has just become a chaotic info dump. I'm here for it. Speaking of info dump, let's start the Pompeii section by discussing gladiators. Because my first thought when conceptualizing ancient disability was like, gladiators got injured. How did society process that? But first, we get to dispel some gladiatorial myths because I like this topic, so we're gonna do that. Most notably is that they were not beautifully chiseled celebrities that women fawned over and men were jealous of. And also generally Romans were very half and half on whether they enjoyed or supported the games or cared about them at all. There are quotes of people complaining as to like the mere butchery of the games and how brutal and low and corrupting they could be, as well as simply just being a waste of time, which is also mostly what people say about Roman games today, and also like other sports today. I feel like the WWE is a good modern equivalent of how people felt about gladiators and whatnot, but like a little bit more mainstream because it's one of their only options for entertainment, and it was also endorsed by the emperor, so everybody would be like, yay, emperor, at the beginning of the games. Made you look like a good person, so you kind of needed to be there. Anyway, gladiators were sometimes seen as celebrities in the sense that like people had particular fighters that they rooted for, but culturally they were some of the lowest status people, categorized as people who sold their bodies for entertainment along with actors and sex workers, and therefore legally had no social or legal status, which meant that they couldn't vote or testify in court. Some gladiators were enslaved people who were then forced into gladiatorial training while others chose that career. They were typically owned by a wealthy person who would rent them out to other wealthy people for shows, kind of like how rich people own football teams, and rich people would sponsor games for social clout. Gladiators also had some of the best healthcare available for Romans at the time, seeing some of the best doctors that the Roman world had to offer. In an excavation of a gladiator graveyard, wow, words. In an excavation of a gladiator graveyard, archaeologists discovered that their bones showed a vegetarian diet rich in simple carbohydrates and legumes, as well as calcium supplements, known based on written record to be ancient protein shakes of charred wood or bone ash. Ew. But also, this is how we know the gladiators were in fact quite fat. And honestly, that makes sense when you think about their line of work. It would make for a better show for the onlookers and more likely for them to survive. Like if you get more injured and you seem to bleed a lot, the damage wouldn't actually be as bad because you can't hit a muscle because they're chunkier. Gladiators also often did not die in combat, and combat was not always man-to-man. Some were beast hunts. My favorite fun fact about this being that one of the foreign beasts that they brought to a games in Pompeii was known as a camel leopard, which is a giraffe. For some reason that makes me imagine just a little baby giraffe getting loose and wandering all like wobbly-kneed down the streets of Pompeii and being like, oh boy, what a big adventure. Anyway, the reason for this side question to gladiators is that many disabilities were actually assets to gladiators. Despite them having some of the best medical care around, many gladiators would go into matches with a patch over one eye, and nobody is quite sure as to whether that was in reference to Cyclops or just like I have a big injury, which means I'm really experienced, so you should fear me situation. But in general, for gladiators and people who had been to battle, most wounds were not disqualifying or super shameful, but they also weren't necessarily a point of pride either. For war veterans, after Alexander the Great, having battle wounds became more appreciated, as it meant like, oh, the commanders were being good leaders by sharing the hardships with their troops. And some injuries, such as the loss of an eye, were seen as marks of honor, which, again, I feel like there's like an unspoken veteran injury hierarchy of sorts in modern day as well, or maybe I'm making that up. I just feel like I've heard stories of veterans with certain wounds being treated less seriously or blamed for their injuries in comparison to other veterans. But anyway, in the shame category, we also, as I mentioned earlier in the video, know about settlements of men injured in battle who were too ashamed to go home and instead lived out the rest of their lives together in their own little colonies. Another totally unrelated thing that is vaguely related, because it's in the myth category, that we need to talk about is the whole Pompeii is frozen in time situation. And there's two sides to this. The pre-eruption side is more complicated, so we're going to start with the post-eruption bit. It's not a lost or forgotten city. After the eruption, some Pompeians likely went back to see if anything was left and to see if they could salvage any of their stuff. And then there was like a lot of looting that happened through tunnels that people dug in the ruins. Sometimes people died in those tunnels or they left things behind. There's also early archaeologists in the Victorian era who were effectively just looters who were like, I am a scientist, because they had no system or logic to what they were doing and destroyed a lot of things. Also, it got bombed in World War II. So it's not like some pristine magic time capsule of a place in any sense at all whatsoever. But even if all of that had not happened and it was suddenly discovered today, the Pompeii that got covered with ash was also not perfectly stopped in time either. Because volcanoes typically don't just suddenly erupt out of the blue. That's not how geology works. There's usually some earthquakes and some releases of gases and whatnot that goes on beforehand that, even if you don't know a single thing about geology or what a volcano is, might make somebody go, that mountain's a little funky. I'm gonna get out of here, actually. And in 62 AD, 17 years before the eruption, there was a giant earthquake that was likely of 5 or 6 magnitude, and according to written records, the shaking lasted for several days, so there's probably a lot of aftershocks, and it's widely accepted that a lot of people left the city after this, reasonably so. Also, the death toll was pretty high. But in the subsequent years, Pompeii tried to rebuild, but often they would rebuild things only for a fault line to do a little scoot and then crack the things again. And the ones most likely to have left were going to be the rich ones who had the means to do so, and there's evidence of many people moving under one roof, with sections of rich people's estates being used for living in by other people or for storing building materials, and broken things meant to be rebuilt, including statues that used to live in the forum were just like vibing in people's houses. And one would assume that seismic activity and whatnot would have continued to ramp up before the infamous eruption, including also the time Seneca wrote about the sudden death of a flock of like 600 sheep who grazed at the base of the mountain. That was definitely due to like poisonous gas releases from the volcano. And I also heard some things about the times that birds just dropped dead from the sky and a lot of animals disappeared. So whether Pompeians thought, I feel like that mountain's going to explode, or wow, birds are dropping from the sky, we are definitely cursed and we should get out of here. Either way, a lot of them left before the eruption actually happened, leaving a fairly small portion of the population there when the eruption occurred. So saying that Pompeii is a frozen in time perfect view of Roman daily life is the equivalent of going somewhere 3 days before a hurricane is about to hit, and most everybody's evacuated and everything's boarded up, and going, this current state of existence is normal life for this entire population and era of people. Now, the reason we're talking about this is because in thinking about what Pompeii would have looked like to its disabled citizens, how many people were left behind because it was too inaccessible to try to get them out? We've talked before on this channel about how in times of natural disasters, disabled people are hit the hardest. But the biggest problem in all of this is that most disaster evacuation plans don't actually have any accessible options. Many public shelters are inaccessible. The rubber boats that they use to get people out during floods can be impossible for wheelchair users to get into. And in the case of Hurricane Katrina, most evacuation buses did not have wheelchair lifts, many of the emergency shelters were inaccessible, and people with visual and hearing impairments were unable to obtain local safety information. We literally get left behind. And not only does climate change make disabilities more disabling for already disabled people, how many times can I say disability in a sentence? But they also create new disabilities. Many health outcomes and diseases are sensitive to climate, including heat-related mortality or morbidity, air pollution-related illnesses, infectious diseases, particularly those transmitted indirectly via water or by insect or rodent vectors, and refugee health issues linked to forced population migration. Yet, changing landscapes can significantly affect local weather more acutely than long-term climate change. Land cover change can influence microclimatic conditions, including temperature, evapotranspiration, and surface runoff, that are key determinants in the emergence of many infectious diseases. Now, I couldn't find any particular research into this phenomenon in Pompeii, but to be fair, I found approximately 0 things about ancient disability in Pompeii altogether, so we're kind of going rogue here based on what we learned about ancient Roman disability. But I would imagine that an already inaccessible place that relies a lot on walking after a giant earthquake would become a lot more inaccessible. Blind and low vision folks used to knowing where everything is would suddenly get disoriented or trip over things and get injured. Folks with dizziness disorders would be sick for weeks after the quake. Gases coming from the volcano, while not noticeable by most, might cause serious issues for friends with asthma or tuberculosis. People with mobility issues might get trapped in various places because they cannot get over rubble. And I would imagine that the quake itself was a mass disabling event that caused a lot of injuries. There's also the element of change. A developmentally disabled person who's only able to function when everything is just so may now have to learn to live somewhere else and have their daily routine disrupted because the building they went to every day is now destroyed or their path is different, and they would really struggle with that. And also for many disabilities, sameness is how we make things accessible for ourselves, and the quake took that away from a lot of people. There have also been several excavations of disabled bodies trapped by ash in Pompeii, with one story I read about a couple that both had a severe form of tuberculosis that may have made escape impossible. And there's evidence that the historical treatment for tuberculosis that we know from Victorian times was also a thing way back when, where going to places with cleaner air, more toward the south of Italy or the north of Africa, would help with their tuberculosis. So it's very likely that there were higher proportions of people with tuberculosis living in this seaside town than in other towns in Roman antiquity. And obviously, we would not be able to know the full stories of everyone there, but I would imagine that many people realized that they didn't have the ability to run and just sat in their houses waiting for the ash to come down, which I understand why a person would not want to research this stuff, or would be like, they're all just people who died tragically. Why does it matter who is able or disabled? Why does finding all this stuff matter? But I think this is a really great time to say why this matters. And why what really reasonably should have been a 15-minute video for the sake of just getting a good grade and graduating, but then I got genuinely excited, became probably, oh, we're gonna be at least 30, 45 minutes. Our history, that of disabled people, that of women, that of queer people, that of poor people, that of trans people, that of every single marginalized human, has been written pretty much by wealthy cishet white men. And that is why I, personally, have particularly never cared for human history, because I don't really care about what a cishet white man stabbed another cishet white man in year 1300. I feel very distant from that. Like, what does it matter? But when we start going through history with a different eye, one that points out that disabled people have always existed, that queer people have always existed, that poor people have always existed, that's when it starts to matter to more people. We start to see ourselves in our ancestors and feel more connected to the history we're learning about. We start to uncover more holistic views of history and humanity that we can learn from. We find the forgotten stories and the forgotten legacies and all the things that make humans human. And what is history if not the study of all of the ups and downs of humanity? And when we're so used to sitting in classrooms having to learn about the next white dude who was praised for committing genocide, having somebody go, hey, did you know that Julius Caesar had seizures? Or like, this famous playwright you really adore was probably autistic just like you. That suddenly changes your entire worldview and makes minority people more engaged in our own history, which teaches us a lot more about our present and also makes us feel more valuable as humans who exist because we've always existed. Like, I'm sorry to my professor, I love you, please cover your ears for this sentence, but I genuinely tried to be interested and engaged in the history of Pompeii this entire semester because I wanted to learn more about it. I've heard all the legends and I've been there, but taking the time here to really find people like me, the people who are forgotten about, just as much as we're forgotten about now, that energized me to learn more of the history and got me excited about learning in a way that I haven't all semester. And I think that's really cool and also really, really important. And also why it's time for a little conversation about accessibility, because that's where everything always goes with me. Now, I've taken deep dives into the world of disability studies in all kinds of fields. We've talked about on this channel disability within psychology and medicine, within literature, within theater, within music. Not so much, we're getting there. But disability studies in archaeology has been very interesting to me to discover because unlike all of those other disciplines, most of the leading researchers in this topic are openly non-disabled, which at first made me go, what? But then I did more research into it and I realized that this actually makes complete and total sense. Due to what? Oh, right, inaccessibility. First, there's the clear barrier to entry. In order to be a high-level archaeologist, you need to get a degree. And in order to get a degree, you need to go to college or university and do well, which is often impossible due to access barriers. And in order to get to the college or university, you have to do well in high school, which is often impossible due to access barriers. And also there's the whole graduate degree bit, which they also expect, which generally means more school. And then in order to become a lead researcher in archaeology, you also need to, on some level, have some experience working at an archaeological site, which again, makes logical sense. But when you realize the fact that archaeological sites are often in the middle of nowhere, that working in them involves a lot of climbing into weird holes, working on weird terrain, and exposure to the elements, you begin to realize the potential issues with this. Thinking about Pompeii in particular, I didn't go to the active archaeological site portion of the city. If it was anything like the rest of the ruins, I can tell you right now that it would be super dangerous for me to work there. The first major thing is that as much as I love Italy, I am allergic to a lot of things, and the southern portion of the country is generally pretty bad with respecting allergens and having allergen-friendly food available. We were only in the south for like 3 or 4 days. Every single meal that I ate was an absolute, it was a night. It was so stressful. There's also the fact that Pompeii gets really hot really quickly because of where it is located on the planet. I get dehydrated really quickly. I don't handle extreme heat very well, particularly when doing physical work, so I would definitely pass out on the job if I were doing that day after day. And then there's the physical inaccessibility of the place. I remember walking around the city with all of these uneven cobblestones and very carefully watching my step and specifically thinking to myself, how would historical people get around these places, particularly with the stones on the streets that were elevated to get overflowing wastewater? But that's also not just for historical disabled people. When you walk around Italy in general, you don't realize the fact that you almost never see any disabled people out and about because it's so physically inaccessible. Which, like, I noticed because I was trying to find people like me and I was like, where are they? They are not here. This is really weird and creepy. Like, they just don't exist. And also, for the record, my friend who does archaeology stuff read over the script and told me that Pompeii is one of the more accessible dig sites in the world of archaeology. So there's also that. Now, I had a lot of conversations with various native Italians while I was there about this, and their arguments were always like, everything's old, so it's not practical to make it accessible. But the fact that the Colosseum is almost entirely accessible with an elevator and clear signage and ramps while also being really well preserved definitely makes me disagree with that. And I found some resources online for this video about the sections of Pompeii that are more mobility aid friendly and how there are specific tours for disabled people, but they mostly focus on the smaller things that are on the perimeter of the city. And I don't quite have solutions for how things could be fixed because architecture is not my thing, but it's definitely something that has come up in my brain a lot, both when I was there and now. What's important about this, though, is that without having disabled archaeologists who are there at the excavation sites, a lot of important things are probably being missed in the same way that original archaeologists in the Victorian era were just kind of looking through random things and drawing conclusions based on their lived experiences as wealthy cishet white European men. Completely different views of daily life in Pompeii appeared when women archaeologists entered the field. And with queer archaeologists and archaeologists of color, all who face their own access barriers to get into the world of archaeology, but most of those are not necessarily physical barriers. One story I really like about this is the story of Janet Stevens, who's an archaeological hairdresser and uses period-accurate hairdressing tools to recreate hairstyles thought to have been wigs for forever because nobody knew that they would be physically possible, which gives us a completely different view of ancient fashion than we ever would have had without her. A lot of minority people in history are always being written about, and they're never the ones doing the writing. And with disability in particular, most of what we know about us from antiquity is the what do we do with them aspects, because legal status and whatnot are the only things written down. And everything that we read about these disabled people comes through the lens of the social attitudes of the time. Archaeology is much less tied up by those social attitudes or of what people back then deemed worthy of writing about, and can instead learn directly from these people from the things that they left behind. Given the context of how Pompeii met its end and disabled people's inability to flee, I think this site specifically probably has a lot of elements of disability history within it that have simply been overlooked by people who are unfamiliar with what the ancient equivalent of a stim toy might have looked like, or that somebody might even need one, or what other DIY prostheses and accommodations that somebody in the community would look at and immediately recognize. And given the fact that most of Pompeii's research centers around daily Roman life, having a disabled and otherwise intersectional perspective there is really, really important in learning more about disability in ancient and modern history as well. But to conclude this whole marathon of a video, I think that we've learned some really important things today. First of all, archaeology is a really cool field that's also really inaccessible, and I don't necessarily have solutions, but I definitely feel like there should be some, and not enough people, according to my research, are talking about this. Second, humans are gonna human, no matter when in history a thing happens, and we aren't all that different from each other if we really look at things critically. And three, seeing yourself included in the history that we teach is way more important than people think. It makes us feel less alone today in our struggles as minority people, and I don't know, thinking about a little kid carefully walking through those cobblestone streets so as not to trip and playing with a cool rock that they found to get some sensory input as they go about their daily routine that never changes. They go to this section of the market to get this thing and they bring it over here to eat that snack, whatever. That makes ruins like Pompeii feel a lot less like a forgotten city of random people from forever ago and a little bit more of a piece of who I am and who I'm meant to be. So let's not forget that. I didn't mean to get this deep. The last month of my life has been weird, and the fact that I'm about to graduate has made me really sappy and weird, but I hope that you learned something today. I sure did. And thank you for watching. Thank you for celebrating my officially finishing the experience that was my undergraduate degree. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.